And right now, the Russians are having a difficult time because they've had the Starlink satellite communication system turned off relatively effectively, and almost overnight. Ukraine implemented this whitelisting system with SpaceX. So if you're a Ukrainian soldier or if you're a Ukrainian volunteer and you've got a Starlink system, you can now register it with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And if you don't register your Starlink, it just won't work within the borders of Ukraine. So Russia had been relying on Starlink for a lot of its battle fleet communications, and now they just don't work. They relied on them for piloting some of their long-range aerial drones and some of their ground drones, and they don't work anymore. So this has been really disruptive for the Russians. And at the same time, the Russian government has banned or heavily restricted Telegram, which is also Telegram is a popular Russian messaging app, which doesn't really get that much use in the UK, but in the post-Soviet space in Ukraine, Russia, etc., it's ubiquitous. Everyone uses it. So a lot of military activities in Russia is coordinated on Telegram, even though it's not secure, and it's always been heavily suspected that the Russian security services have had access to it. But even that level of access has not been enough. So the Russian government is pushing Russians to move over to this new app called Max, which is developed by the Russian government and is, heavily controlled. It's essentially a version of the Chinese WeChat. That's the idea. It's this kind of ubiquitous everything app that's designed to be heavily monitored, and they can crack down on dissent very, very easily. They could do that with Telegram, but not quite as easily. And again, that just demonstrates the kind of total control that Putin wants to have over his people, even people in his military, which he doesn't always trust the military. He has some of the most trenchant critics of his rule, even though they are ultra nationalist critics, are from military circles sometimes.
And Russia has tried to rebuild their own Starlink system. They've launched something called the Barrage 1 unmanned stratospheric platform. Is there any sign that's going to be able to patch up the loss of Starlink, or that the Russians have any technology that can replace that system?
No, that's an aerostat. That's a big balloon with a 5G repeater on it. That's not new. In fact, the Ukrainians have been doing something relatively similar. More impressively as well, there's a Ukrainian company called Aerobavona. They've done some very interesting things with balloons. No, it's at best, a band-aid on a gaping open wound, and it's nowhere near as good as Starlink. One of the great things about Starlink is it's very difficult to jam. There's a couple of very expensive EW systems that can jam it, but there's maybe one or two actually in the whole of Ukraine on the Russian side. But generally, it's very, very difficult to jam. It's very fast. And yeah, it's been used very effectively by the Russians and by the Ukrainians, and now the Russians can't use it. So that's a significant boost for the Ukrainians, and the chaos that this created, this sudden lack of communication created on the Russian side, has led the Ukrainians to be able to mount some small counteroffensives. They've taken a number of villages. They've pushed back in Zaporizhia and also in Donetsk as well. So it's not going particularly well for the Russians at the moment, although they are still advancing in other areas of the front.
And there are reports that Russia is changing the way it recruits for its ongoing conflict in Ukraine, replacing its sort of biannual draft with a rolling draft. What does this tell us about the situation and the need for troops that Russia has in this conflict?
So the majority of Russian soldiers that fight in Ukraine are not actually draftees; they're volunteers, and they've been incentivized to volunteer via large signing bonuses. There is some evidence that is not as persuasive as it was, or that all the people that would be willing to sign up for these bonuses have now signed up, and the life of an average soldier in Ukraine is not long. These people live short, brutal lives when they come to Ukraine. So what the Russians are doing is they're heavily recruiting from overseas. There have been multiple cases where individuals from sub-Saharan Africa particularly have been lured to Russia on promises of employment and then forced to sign military contracts. And again, these people are used as completely disposable cannon fodder. In one case, relatively recently, one African soldier, I think he was from Kenya, he was shown the Russians had strapped a TM-62 anti-tank landmine to his chest and used him essentially as a involuntary suicide bomber to storm Ukrainian positions. And you can search for this online. You can see videos of this, and they were shouting racial epithets at him as they pushed him towards the front. So this is the kind of people the Russians are, and they want manpower. They don't really care where they get it from. If they can, get some poor African mercenaries, or even not mercenaries, people that are recruited through, subterfuge, they don't care. They have no moral problem with that at all.
And on the other side of this conflict, of course, Ukraine is still facing probably one of the harshest winters it has in this war. What are the conditions like in Kiev now? And is there a sign of an end to this harsh winter and the energy crisis Ukraine's been facing?
Yeah, so conditions are definitely better. A couple of weeks ago, it was down to -28, which is astonishingly cold. You get hypothermia in minutes rather than hours in that sort of temperature. It was actually colder in Kyiv than it was at the North Pole, which is an astonishing fact, really. But yeah, no, it's gotten warmer now. Today is only, well, the low today is only -13. It's about -7 at the moment. So I mean, for British audiences, that seems very, very cold. But I can tell you, after you've experienced temperatures of -28, -7 feels really, really warm. In terms of the power, it's gotten better, but it's still, I don't have power at the moment. I'm running my light on a power bank. We have maybe 6-7 hours of power a day now, which is up from about 2 hours when it was really, really bad. We don't have any heating. We have water, thankfully, but there are lots of buildings in Kyiv that are still without water, without power, and without electricity. So it's still very difficult here. But there is a feeling that we're kind of over the hill, and I think what the Russians seem to think is that if they put enough pressure on the Ukrainian people, they'll storm the Rada and demand that the government signs a peace deal, and that's just not how Ukrainians think at all. At all.
There has, of course, been a response from the Ukrainians, though, not one that necessarily threatens to collapse the military effort in any way. It's important to add. But Herman Galushenko, the former energy minister, has reportedly been arrested trying to cross the Ukrainian border. Is there a sign in there that the anti-corruption authorities do now have the kind of space and authority needed to work towards some level of justice, if that's what's needed?
I mean, they always have. One of the intriguing things about Ukraine is that although obviously this country has historically had problems with corruption, the anti-corruption authorities here are very powerful, and they are genuinely independent from the executive. Unlike, for example, in the United States, there are no presidential pardons that can just magically appear when a friend of the president has put his hand in the cookie jar. So this is a good sign. Corruption is a cancer at the best of times. It's absolutely more of a cancer during wartime. And yeah, I think it's a sign that the state is working effectively. Obviously, there needs to be more anti-corruption investigations. Anyone that has stolen money from the Ukrainian people should end up in jail. And I think that's if you speak to Ukrainians, they are furious about corruption. The idea that these people are stealing money from the Ukrainian people when soldiers have to fundraise everything from tourniquets to pickup trucks to eco-flows. It's incredibly, and it makes Ukrainians furious fundamentally.
And as you mentioned before, there are some of these Ukrainian counterattacks taking advantage of the Starlink confusion in Russia. Some counterattacks near Huliopol have retaken some small settlements. Is there any sign of Ukraine breaking that grinding sort of trench-like warfare, though?
No, these counterattacks are at a tactical level, and they are localized, but they're still significant because essentially what you've seen is instead of Russia continuously advancing in most places along the front, you're seeing Ukraine pushing them back. And probably more significant was just before Christmas. You saw a very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kupiansk, where Second Hearty Corps managed to outflank the Russians and humiliate Vladimir Putin because he'd announced the capture of the city just a couple of weeks before. But I think what this proves is that this war is not decided, and that anyone that says Ukraine has just been defeated and should surrender is clearly wrong, because there are things that the West can do, like cutting Russia off from Starlink, that have significant impact on the ground here. And I think we should be smart at identifying areas of Russian weakness and, putting pressure on those areas of Russian weakness.
Thank you for watching Frontline. For all the latest updates on the war in Ukraine and global security, you should subscribe to this channel. You can also hear us on Times Radio's overnight programming, and you can also find us wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can listen to Times Radio, or you can read the latest news at thetimes.com, and you can go over and subscribe to the Times YouTube channel for the latest news and analysis on all global news updates. Remember, for the latest on US news, you can listen to the Trump Report wherever you get your podcasts, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.